What if I told you that everything you've been told about justice, about fairness, about what's right, might be wrong? What if the very system that's supposed to protect you is the one that's been crushing you all along? This is the story of Naomi Carter, a young woman who was forced into the darkest corner of the criminal justice system, falsely accused and thrown away like she was nothing. But what if I told you that being thrown into the fire was the only thing that could turn Naomi into something even stronger? Imagine being stripped of everything, your freedom, your dignity, your hope, and yet still finding a way to fight back. Naomi didn't just survive the system, she broke it, and she did it in a way that no one saw coming. This story isn't just about survival, it's about transformation, defiance, and the kind of courage that shatters the very rules that were meant to keep her down. Stick around, because by the end of this video, you'll see how one woman changed everything, and how she gave a voice to the countless others who thought they were invisible. Don't blink, because Naomi's story is about to rewrite everything you thought you knew about justice. The cold morning air clung to Blackwood, the kind of chill that seeped into your bones and refused to let go. The city, once a proud industrial giant, now stood in decay. Its streets lined with abandoned factories, cracked sidewalks, and the silent echoes of dreams that never made it past survival. In West Hollow, the forgotten corner of the city, Naomi Carter moved through the streets like a shadow. 19 years old, tall and slender, her deep brown skin contrasted against the pale morning fog. Her thick, coiled hair framed a face sharpened by hardship, high cheekbones, full lips, and eyes that had seen more than they should have. She walked fast, pulling the hood of her jacket tighter around her face, instinctively avoiding the gaze of the patrol car crawling down the block. It didn't matter that she was on her way to work. It didn't matter that she had no record. In places like West Hollow, girls like her didn't get the benefit of the doubt. Her mother, Angela Carter, had warned her since she was little. You don't get to make mistakes, baby. You don't get to be in the wrong place at the wrong time. You don't get second chances. Naomi never questioned it. She had seen too much: boys pulled from classrooms in handcuffs, families torn apart overnight, lives swallowed by the system before they even had a chance to begin. She had learned early on how to stay invisible, but on that day, invisibility wasn't enough. The corner store was packed, the scent of burnt coffee mixing with the stale smell of old magazines. Naomi had just stepped inside, barely glancing at the cashier when the doors flew open. Chaos, screams, a man shoving past her, breathless, eyes wild. A second later, sirens, then hands, rough, unrelenting, grabbing her arms. On the ground, now! She barely had time to react before her face hit the tile, cold and unforgiving. "It's not me," she gasped, struggling, her heart slamming against her ribs. "Stay down." Boots scraped against the floor. Radios crackled. The weight of a knee pressed into her back, crushing the air from her lungs. She barely saw the real suspect disappearing into an alley outside. No one was chasing him. No one even looked his way. They already had their target. And she fit the description. Naomi sat in the holding cell for hours, her mind spinning. This wasn't happening. This couldn't be happening. She had never stolen anything, never been in a fight, never even skipped school. But it didn't matter. The officers didn't care. The public defender assigned to her case barely glanced at her file before shaking his head. "Look, just take the plea deal. It's the fastest way out." "Plea deal, but I didn't do anything." "Yeah, well, that's not how the system works." Her trial lasted barely 15 minutes. The surveillance footage was blurry. The witness, a frightened old man behind the counter, was pressured into certainty. And just like that, Naomi Carter was convicted. She didn't remember the words the judge spoke. Only the sound of her mother crying in the back of the courtroom, her fingers digging into her chest like she was trying to hold her heart together. The cuffs closed around Naomi's wrists like iron shackles, heavy, final. And just like that, she was gone. The first night in Blackwood Penitentiary felt like an eternity, and Naomi had barely settled into the harsh reality before she understood. The walls didn't just keep people in, they smothered them. Her cell, small and damp, was a cold, silent tomb. She could hear the faint rustling of footsteps in the hallway, the clang of metal doors closing, but none of it felt real. It felt like she was trapped in someone else's nightmare, far removed from everything she had known. She lay on the narrow cot, staring at the ceiling, the faint light from the flickering bulb above casting long shadows across the stone walls. Everything was different now. The world she once knew, with its crowded streets, the echo of her mother's voice calling her home, the promise of a life not yet lived, all of it was gone. The next morning came fast, the heavy sound of a prison bell ringing through the air. Naomi had no time to think before the guards came to her cell. The door slid open with a metal screech. "You're on the line today." She blinked, barely able to register the words, before a rough hand yanked her to her feet. Her mind raced. She wasn't even sure what the line was, but she didn't ask questions. That was the first rule here. Don't ask. Don't show fear. The guards marched her down the long, narrow hallways of the prison. The air felt thick with the smell of sweat, metal, and something far worse, the smell of surrender. Naomi could see it in the eyes of the women she passed. Eyes that were once full of life, but now dulled by years of routine. Faces etched with the scars of time, of survival, of lost hopes. She was led into the prison yard, a vast gray expanse surrounded by high concrete walls topped with barbed wire. Women milled about, some sitting on the cracked concrete benches, others pacing in small circles, their faces twisted in thought. This was it. This was her new life. A sharp whistle pierced the air, and Naomi was guided to a workstation, handed a broom and a bucket. The task was simple: sweep and scrub. But what the guards didn't say was the punishment for doing it wrong. They didn't need to. It was known. She worked silently, her eyes darting around, trying to get a read on the women around her. A heavy-set woman, with her head shaved and tattoos curling down her neck, watched her from across the yard. The woman's gaze was sharp, calculating. She could sense Naomi's unease. Naomi could feel her stomach twist, but she didn't show it. Not here. Not with eyes like those on her. As Naomi scrubbed the concrete beneath her feet, the woman finally spoke. "You're new here, aren't you?" Her voice was gruff, hardened by years inside. Naomi nodded, not trusting her voice. "Better watch your back. This place, it chews you up and spits you out. You think you're tough, but this is a different game." The woman leaned forward, her gaze narrowing. "In here, you either make your peace with it, or you're nothing." Naomi didn't respond. What was there to say? She'd never been in a place like this, where the rules were written in blood and fear. She had never been so small, so vulnerable. For weeks, Naomi fell into a silent rhythm: work, eat, sleep. There was no room for thinking, no space to breathe. Each day bled into the next, an endless cycle of doing the same mindless tasks, surrounded by women whose eyes spoke of battles fought long before she arrived. Some tried to break her, offering cruel smiles or whispered threats in the shy hallways. But Naomi kept to herself, focusing only on survival. She didn't have time to think of what was happening outside, didn't have time to dream of a life she would never have. Then, one day, everything changed. She was cleaning a filthy bathroom when the door banged open and two guards stormed in. "Carter, you're being moved. Pack your things." Naomi's heart skipped a beat. Moved? To where? But she didn't ask. She grabbed her meager belongings, a few folded shirts, a tiny toothbrush, and followed them through the winding hallways. She was led to a different part of the prison, a darker, quieter section. She was shoved into a new cell, but this one was different. The women here had a look in their eyes that Naomi couldn't quite place. It wasn't fear, it wasn't submission, it was something else. One woman, tall with long braids, stepped forward. Her eyes were cold, but not unkind. "You're going to have to learn how to survive in here, Naomi. There's no way around it. The system's not going to give you mercy. But you've got something they can't take, your mind." The woman's words echoed in Naomi's mind long after she was alone in her new cell. It wasn't a pep talk. It wasn't hope. It was something sharper, something more dangerous. Naomi realized then that surviving wasn't about physical strength. It was about something else, something deeper. She had to learn how to fight back, not just for her body, but for her soul. The real battle had just begun. The days blended together, one indistinguishable from the next. Naomi had learned to survive the prison's crushing rhythm: work, eat, sleep. It was easier to shut her mind off, to shut out the reality that weighed on her every second. Blackwood Penitentiary was a place where hope went to die, suffocated by concrete walls and the cruel indifference of the people who ran it. But something was different now. Naomi had spent weeks observing, learning the rules of this place, both the spoken and the unspoken ones. The women in her new cell block were hardened, but they carried secrets in their eyes. Some had accepted their fate, others had not. She began to notice the small things, the way some women disappeared for hours and returned covered in bruises, the hush that fell over the yard when certain guards walked by, and more chillingly, the silence surrounding the disappearance of some of the women who had dared to stand up for themselves. Naomi's stomach tightened every time she thought about it. The system here was a machine, and the women were just fuel, discardable when they became a problem. One night, when the cell doors were locked and the prison had quieted down, Naomi sat in the dim light of her cell, her fingers absently tracing the chipped paint on the wall. She had heard rumors from the women in the block, their hushed voices speaking of things that should never happen in a place like this. Lorraine, the woman with the braids who had spoken to Naomi when she first arrived, had become Naomi's only ally. She had been in Blackwood Penitentiary longer than Naomi, and the stories she told haunted Naomi's every thought. Lorraine had a bitter, knowing look in her eyes, as if she had seen it all. "You think you're safe here, Naomi?" Lorraine's voice was low, like the whisper of a storm before it broke. "They don't care about us. You see the guards? They get paid extra for our pain." Naomi's heart skipped. She had heard the rumors, but she hadn't believed them. They couldn't be true. Lorraine's eyes met hers, and in that moment, Naomi saw the truth. Raw and brutal. "Warden Hayes is running a whole operation, Naomi." Lorraine's voice cracked slightly, but she pushed forward. "The women who go missing, they're part of his little system. Some of them, they get sent out, work in places you don't want to know about. Others, they disappear into the shadows." Naomi felt the blood drain from her face. The walls of her cell seemed to close in. "You mean—" Naomi's voice faltered. "He's selling them?" Lorraine nodded slowly. "I didn't say it, but yeah, that's what's happening." A chill ran down Naomi's spine. Her fingers clenched into fists. This was the system. This was what they had been living in all along, corruption so deep, so ingrained, that it had infected every corner of the prison. But it was worse than Naomi had thought. One evening, as Naomi was sweeping the yard, she saw something that made her blood run cold. A guard named Taylor, whose face was perpetually hidden behind dark sunglasses, was escorting one of the younger women, Jasmine, toward the back of the prison. Naomi knew Jasmine. She was young, maybe 18, and had the look of someone who hadn't yet given up on life. But now she was being led like a lamb to slaughter. Naomi's heart pounded in her chest. She had seen the way Taylor had treated Jasmine, flirtatious, possessive. Naomi had learned that some of the women who caught the guard's eyes weren't just prey to them, they were sold. Naomi's breath caught in her throat. She knew she couldn't do anything, not now, not yet. But she couldn't just stand there, watching it happen. She had to know more. She had to understand how deep the corruption ran. Later that night, Naomi and Lorraine huddled together in their cell, whispering as quietly as they could. The walls felt thinner now, the shadows longer, as if the whole prison was listening. "We have to do something." Naomi's voice was firm. "We can't just let them keep doing this." Lorraine looked at her, her gaze hard. "You don't get it, Naomi. You think you can just tell someone and they'll make it stop. You think the cops are gonna care. Hell, even if we had the evidence, we're in their world now." "But we can't let it go on," Naomi said, her voice stronger now. "I'm not going to just sit here knowing what they're doing to these women. We can find a way to expose it." Lorraine's face softened for a moment. "You're brave, Naomi. Too brave for your own good." Naomi's eyes hardened. She had spent too long surviving in silence, too long letting others make the decisions for her. She wasn't going to be quiet anymore. She didn't know how she was going to do it, but she knew one thing for sure. She would find a way to expose the truth, no matter the cost. Her mind was already racing, thinking of how to gather evidence, how to escape the watchful eyes of the guards. It wasn't enough just to survive anymore. She needed justice, and she was going to make sure the world knew the truth. But first, she had to figure out who she could trust. In a place like Blackwood, trust was a dangerous game. One wrong move, and everything could fall apart. The silence of the prison felt suffocating, but Naomi's resolve grew stronger by the minute. She was going to fight back. She was going to take them down, one piece at a time. And there was no turning back. The days that followed felt different. Naomi could feel it in the air, the electricity, the tension, the sense that something was about to snap. It wasn't just the heat of the summer pressing down on the prison yard, suffocating every breath. It was something deeper, something that had been building for months in the undercurrent of the women's whispers. Naomi had made up her mind. She was no longer just a bystander. The truth that Lorraine had shared with her, that bitter, cruel truth, was burning a hole inside her, and there was no way she could live with it anymore. The idea of just surviving was no longer enough. If Naomi was going to live, she had to fight, and she wasn't going to do it alone. Lorraine had been watching her closely over the past few days. The old woman had always been sharp, always calculating, but there was something different in her eyes now. She saw the fire in Naomi that hadn't been there before. "You're serious about this, aren't you?" Lorraine asked. One night, as they sat in their cell, the harsh lights above flickering like the last dying embers of a fire. Naomi nodded without hesitation. "I have to be. We have to make them pay for what they've done. All of them." Lorraine's lips tightened, the corners of her mouth pulling downward. She knew the risks. Naomi could see the doubt in her eyes, but she also saw something else, the glimmer of hope. It was a small thing, but it was enough. Naomi had no intention of turning back. The plan started simple. Gather information, talk to the women who had witnessed the worst of it, the women who had been silenced before. But Naomi knew that exposing the truth wasn't going to be easy. They needed more than just stories. They needed evidence, solid proof that would make it impossible for the outside world to ignore. She spent every moment she could collecting whispers in the dark corners of the prison. She found women who had been too afraid to speak before, women who had lost everything, but still carried a fire in their hearts. They were the ones who would help her burn the walls down. And then came the night that changed everything. Naomi and Lorraine had been talking quietly in their cell when they saw Taylor. the guard she had seen earlier with Jasmine walking by. Naomi's pulse quickened. Tonight was the night. She had spent the past week watching him, learning his routine, knowing exactly when he would pass by their section of the prison. This wasn't a game anymore. This was war. "It's time, Naomi." Lorraine's voice was low, steady. She was nervous, but Naomi could hear the steel in her words now. With a quick, shared look, Naomi and Lorraine moved toward the back of the cell block, slipping out of sight as quietly as shadows. They knew what they had to do. Naomi had memorized every corner of the prison, every blind spot, every guard's movements. Lorraine stayed close, her face set in determination. Naomi could feel the weight of her every step. They were both in this together now. They approached the maintenance room where the guards stored their keys and radios, a place few prisoners ever dared to venture. They had no choice. This was the only way to get the evidence they needed. As they slipped inside, the smell of old metal and grease hit them, mixing with the faint scent of sweat from the guards who used the space. Naomi's heart pounded in her chest. She was so close. Lorraine grabbed the keys, her hands shaking slightly, as she passed them to Naomi. "You sure about this? Once we take these, there's no turning back." Naomi swallowed hard, but nodded. There was no other choice. They moved quickly, ducking into the narrow hallway, past the darkened guards' quarters. Naomi's mind raced with a million thoughts. What if they were caught? What if they were discovered? But she couldn't stop now, not when the truth was so close, not when so many innocent lives had been destroyed. As they reached the guard tower, Naomi could feel the cold metal of the keys in her hand, heavy with the promise of what was to come. She had one shot at this. She had to make it count. And then, as she was about to insert the key into the lock, the door creaked open. It was him, Taylor. For a moment, the world froze. Naomi's breath hitched in her chest. She could feel Lorraine tense beside her, but they didn't move. They couldn't. Taylor stopped just a few feet away, his back to them, unaware of the storm that was about to break. Naomi's pulse hammered in her ears. It was now or never. With a sudden burst of movement, Naomi shoved the door open with all her strength, the keys jangling loudly in the silence. Taylor spun around just in time to see Naomi and Lorraine disappear into the darkness. The game was on. They rushed through the corridors, taking the keys and the stolen radios with them, knowing full well that once they reached the control room, there was no turning back. They were exposing everything. The system, the corruption, the exploitation. Naomi could feel it now, the weight of the truth, the sheer force of what they were about to unleash. They had crossed the point of no return. There would be no more hiding, no more silence. This wasn't just a rebellion. It wasn't just a fight for survival. It was the beginning of a revolution. The silence in the prison felt heavier than usual that night. A tense stillness that hung in the air like a storm cloud waiting to burst. Naomi's heart was still racing from the daring escape with the stolen keys. She could feel the weight of their actions pressing down on her, each breath coming quicker than the last. She didn't know how much time they had before the alarms would go off. Everything they had worked for was hanging by a thread. As Naomi and Lorraine raced down the narrow hallways, adrenaline fueled their every step. The keys were clenched tight in Naomi's hand, her fingers nearly numb with the pressure, but she couldn't stop now. The control room was just up ahead, the place that held the power to expose everything. "Hurry, Naomi, we don't have long." Lorraine's voice was urgent, sharp, but there was something else there. Fear. Naomi didn't answer. She didn't need to. Her eyes were locked ahead, focused only on the door that would unlock the truth. When they finally reached the control room, Naomi's hands trembled as she slid the key into the lock. It clicked, the door groaning open like a reluctant beast. The room was dark, only faintly illuminated by the dim glow of computer screens and the hum of equipment. They slipped inside, their footsteps muffled against the cold tile floor. Naomi approached the desk where the guard's radio sat, and she paused. This was it. This was the moment where it all could either fall apart or break free. With shaking hands, she pulled out the radio's recorder and began to play the last few transmissions, the messages that would expose the corruption of Warden Hayes. It was a life-altering moment. The evidence was here. But the seconds stretched painfully long, and just as Naomi was about to grab the files, she heard a door slam open. Footsteps, heavy, fast. "What the hell are you two doing here?" A deep voice boomed, and Naomi's blood ran cold. It was Taylor. The door slammed shut behind him with a deafening thud. In an instant, Lorraine was moving, grabbing Naomi's arm, pulling her back toward the shadows. "Go! Get out of here!" Lorraine whispered urgently. But Naomi was frozen. This wasn't supposed to happen. Taylor stepped forward, his eyes narrowing in on them. "You think you can just walk in here and take what you want?" His voice was thick with anger. He had been silent in the halls, calculating. But now, there was a look in his eyes. A predator closing in. Naomi's throat tightened. She couldn't move, not without getting caught. "I should have known." Taylor sneered, stepping closer, blocking the door. "You've been stirring things up, haven't you? Thought you could get away with it, but now you're done." There was no escape. The files, the evidence, they were too far out of reach, too close to the edge of being destroyed. Naomi's mind raced as her heart beat like a drum. But then Lorraine lunged. It was a desperate, furious move. But in that instant, it was enough to knock the guard off balance. She hit him with her shoulder, sending him stumbling back toward the wall, giving Naomi the fraction of a second she needed. Naomi seized the opportunity, grabbing the files and the recorder from the desk and bolting toward the door. She could hear Taylor's voice shouting behind her, but she didn't stop. She couldn't afford to. As Naomi and Lorraine sprinted through the dark hallways, the prison seemed to shift. The walls, the doors, the floors, everything was closing in on them. But there was no turning back now. They couldn't let Taylor stop them. They couldn't let the truth be buried any longer. They didn't know how much time they had before the guards would be on full alert. But Naomi knew one thing. If they didn't get out soon, everything they had fought for would be erased. They reached the main yard, their breaths ragged, and the sound of their footsteps echoed through the empty space. There was no going back now. They had what they came for. The evidence that would bring down Warden Hayes and his operation was in their hands. Just as they reached the fence that separated them from freedom, Naomi felt a sharp pain in her side. Taylor was behind them. "You won't make it out alive." Taylor's voice was low and menacing. His footsteps were quick, and Naomi could hear the clink of his gun being pulled from his holster. Naomi's body was on fire with adrenaline, but there was no stopping him now. She turned, ready to face him head-on, but Lorraine stopped her. "We don't have to fight, Naomi." Lorraine's voice was steady, calm, and Naomi looked at her, seeing the acceptance in her eyes. In that moment, Naomi understood. It wasn't just about surviving anymore. It was about standing up for something bigger than themselves, for all the women who had been silenced before. And if they were going to die, then they would do it fighting for the truth. Before Taylor could get any closer, there was a sudden shout, a crash. The other women from the prison block appeared from the shadows, their faces grim but resolute. "You're not alone anymore." One of them, a tall woman named Keisha, spoke, her voice strong and filled with a newfound power. The women surged forward, overwhelming Taylor with sheer numbers, pushing him back as he tried to retreat. Naomi, breathless and shaken, held the evidence close. She had done it. They had done it. But as the guards arrived in force, the women knew there was no going back. The fight for justice had only just begun. The price of truth was steep, and they would pay it together. The roar of chaos echoed through the prison yard as Naomi and Lorraine were dragged away by the guards, their hands cuffed tightly behind them. The women, the ones who had joined in their stand for justice, were being beaten into submission, their cries mingling with the shouts of the officers. It was a brutal, violent response, one that sought to tear apart the very spark of rebellion that had ignited within Blackwood Penitentiary. Naomi's heart was in her throat. Everything had happened so fast. The shock, the fear, the disbelief. She could hardly process the events unfolding around her. She had the evidence. She had the truth in her hands, but at that moment, the weight of their actions seemed so heavy, so dangerous. They had given everything, and now it seemed like they might lose it all. Lorraine, ever the survivor, met Naomi's gaze. "Don't you dare look down, girl." Her voice was gruff, but there was a fierce strength behind it. "You've got something they can't take from you, and we ain't done yet." Naomi swallowed hard. Lorraine was right. They couldn't give up now, even if this fight was going to cost them everything. Even if they were dragged to the edge of defeat, they had already won. The truth had been exposed. The evidence they had stolen was already out there in the hands of the world. They were placed in solitary confinement, a cold, dark cell that felt like a tomb. The walls were bare, the floor hard and unwelcoming. Naomi sank to the ground, the weight of everything crashing down on her. She could feel the bruises on her arms, the swelling in her side, but none of it hurt as much as the thought of losing everything they had fought for. For a long time, there was only silence in that small, oppressive space. Naomi didn't know how much time had passed, hours, days, weeks. All she knew was that every minute felt like an eternity. She stared at the walls, her mind racing. There was no going back now. The world had seen what was happening inside these walls. They couldn't silence them again. And then, as if from nowhere, came a soft knock on the door. Naomi's heart skipped. Was it a guard? Or something worse? The door creaked open and a familiar face appeared. Keisha, the woman who had fought alongside them, her face bruised but still standing tall. "Naomi, Lorraine, you gotta come with me. They're taking us out of here." Naomi barely had time to register the words before Keisha's hand was on her arm, pulling her to her feet. There was a new urgency in the air, something alive with possibility. Naomi couldn't help but follow. They were led down the dark hallways by Keisha and another woman Naomi didn't recognize. The guards were nowhere to be seen, and for a moment, Naomi wondered if this was some kind of trick. But Keisha's face was set with determination. She wasn't playing games. The women didn't stop until they reached the gates of the prison, where a black van sat idling. Naomi's pulse quickened. What was happening? Keisha glanced over her shoulder, her voice low. "We've got people on the outside, activists, lawyers, people who care about the truth. Your story, it's gone public. They can't sweep it under the rug anymore." Naomi's heart pounded in her chest. This was it. This was the chance. She had never felt so alive, so full of purpose. She was getting out, but this wasn't just freedom for her. It was freedom for every woman who had been silenced by Blackwood, every woman who had suffered under the corruption that ran through its walls. The van doors slammed shut behind them and they were driven away, the lights of Blackwood Penitentiary disappearing behind them. Naomi's body was bruised, battered, but her spirit? It was stronger than it had ever been. Days later, Naomi found herself standing in front of a group of reporters, flashing cameras, microphones aimed at her face. The world was watching. She had never imagined it would come to this. To her, standing as a voice for the voiceless, for the women who had never had the chance to speak, she opened her mouth, and for the first time in years, the truth poured out. The story of Warden Hayes, the exploitation, the corruption, it all came spilling forth, every detail laid bare for the world to see. And just like that, the tide turned. Naomi's case was reopened. A full investigation was launched into the operations inside Blackwood Penitentiary. The truth could not be denied any longer. It wasn't just the end of Warden Hayes's reign, it was the beginning of something new. Naomi had done what so many thought was impossible. She had stood up to the system, and she had won. But it didn't stop there. Naomi knew there was more to be done. The fight wasn't over. She wasn't done changing the world. She started a foundation for women who had been wrongly incarcerated, a place where they could find legal support, education, and a chance to rebuild their lives. Lorraine, still by her side, became a symbol of resilience and strength. Together they fought for the rights of the women who had been forgotten. And Naomi Carter. She became a legend, a woman who had come from the depths of the system's cruelty and risen to become the voice of those who had no voice. Her journey had just begun, but already she had changed the world. And as she looked out at the sea of women who had joined her cause, Naomi smiled, knowing that no matter what, she had won. And so had they. Thank you so much for sticking with Naomi's story until the end. Isn't it incredible how one person's fight against injustice can change everything? Naomi didn't just stand up for herself, she gave a voice to those who thought they had none. But her story isn't just inspiring, it's a call to action. So let me ask you, what's stopping you from standing up for what's right? What walls are you letting hold you back? Naomi showed us that no matter how impossible the odds, we all have the power to break free. It's about choosing to rise even when the world tells you to stay down. Now ask yourself, how are you going to take this power and use it to transform your own life? What change can you create today, no matter how big or small, that will set you on a path toward your own victory? I want to hear from you. Drop a comment below and let's talk about how you plan to apply what you've learned today. Do you feel ready to take on your own battle? What's the first step you'll take to fight for your truth? And don't forget, if you haven't already, subscribe to the channel and hit the notification bell. That way, you'll never miss out on more powerful stories and lessons that could help change your life. Thanks for watching, and remember, your story isn't over yet, it's only just beginning.